Hello, everyone. I'm Nate Truex, and you're listening to the Croccast Podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Croccast Podcast. I'm your host, Nate, and today I'm joined by Brandon Sideleau. Uh, Brandon, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Nice to talk to you.
So, Brandon, you want to talk to us a little bit about what you do and your career path up to this point?
Yeah, sure. So I first became interested in crocodilians, well, as a child, really. But I didn't start working with them in any real capacity until about 2010, when I was in my late 20s, actually. Up until that point, I was working as a wildlife photographer and various other jobs. I always had an interest in biology and crocodilians, but my math skills weren't the best at the time, at least. So I was always uncertain that I would be able to complete the degree. Turns out I was underestimating myself, which is, I guess, often the case for a lot of people. And so in about 2010, I went back to school, got my degree. But around the same time that I started doing this, um, I started compiling crocodile attacks or crocodilian attacks worldwide. And I was touching base with a lot of crocodile specialists, a lot of local wildlife authorities, forestry officers, stuff like that, trying to get as much data as possible. And over time, the data increased significantly, and I started finding things that were different than what people had thought, particularly with the saltwater crocodile and the mugger crocodile. For a long time, people thought that attacks by the saltwater crocodile were relatively rare nowadays, despite the size of the animal, which turned out, unfortunately, not to be the case. And the mugger crocodile was long believed to be harmless, which is also not the case. And then, as things evolved, we started finding more and more interesting stuff. Um, the project at the time was called Croc Bite. That no longer exists in that format. Now it's called Croc Attack, and the old website is gone. The new website will be launched pretty soon. It's already been made. It's just a matter of ironing out all the little details and everything because it's a really complex database. And right now I'm actually living in Darwin, Australia. I'm from California originally, but I'm living in Darwin and doing my PhD here, studying human crocodile conflict. It's kind of a culmination of all this because I'm going to be looking at the whole range of the saltwater crocodile, the entire range, and looking at the true extent of human crocodile conflict, and also potential causes and potential solutions, which are going to be different by region, of course. And my field work will primarily be in Papua New Guinea.
Gotcha. So, where are some other places you've worked at besides in Darwin and Papua New Guinea?
Well, I did a lot of work in Indonesia, actually, in the province of East Nusa Tenggara. In 2015 and 2017, I spent several weeks there, going to different islands, collecting data, interviewing residents of villages, mostly on the islands of West Timor, Sumba, Lambada, and Flores, and found a lot of really interesting data, a lot of interesting opinions, in that entire province, except for Flores. In that entire province, we found that most of the people had similar crocodile totem beliefs to what you might find in Timor-Leste, which is also known as East Timor, as well as a few other areas. And I guess historically, those beliefs were much more widespread throughout Indonesia and Malaysia and in the Philippines, but they kind of have been pushed back into these more remote areas. But yeah, it was very interesting. So that was where I did the bulk of my work. But I've also worked with friends and colleagues in Belize, and then in an unofficial capacity in Mexico. I've done some. There was a project I was doing in Mexico looking at American crocodile uh, head length to body length ratios, but it kind of got stalled for political reasons. Um, People not wanting to let us into certain areas to do measurements and stuff like that. So that's kind of stalled, but it would have been, we got some interesting data because there are some very large American crocodiles, Crocodilus acutus, in some parts of Jalisco state that are abnormally large, really larger than anything I've seen anywhere else. So except maybe the Tarcoles River in Costa Rica. So.
Okay. So about those totem beliefs in Indonesia, can you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, so it's very similar to Timor Leste. They believe that the crocodiles are their ancestors. So basically, when grandparents or anybody really dies, they believe that their soul will inhabit the crocodile. And now I don't know the exact details of it. I haven't studied that much of the cultural anthropological side of it, which I plan to do that in more greater detail on my PhD because I'm going to look at the similarities between the beliefs in Papua New Guinea, which are, I believe they're quite different, but I'm interested to see if there are any commonalities. Yeah, so basically killing a crocodile is very much a taboo thing in Timor-Leste and East Nusa Tenggara. It does happen, but it's rare, and it's usually only if there's a man-eater involved, and even then, it's not always going to be killed. And also, you have not everyone believes, the same thing. So you do have other belief systems, and then I know in some areas you have people who used to live in the highlands coming down to the coastal areas, and they don't harbor the same feelings towards crocodiles, so they will kill crocodiles as well. But in general, it is still much more of a taboo subject there for a crocodile to be killed, even sometimes when it's attacked a person. And they also believe that, some crocodiles are their ancestors and some are not. So it varies very much. But there's a lot more specifics to it that I'm not fully aware of, but I definitely plan on going on into that in more detail. I know these beliefs were also once commonplace in Sulawesi. Up until fairly recent. I think they still are in some parts of Sulawesi. And then, of course, 200 years ago, it was present throughout the entire archipelago, including all the way up into the Philippines. But those have largely been eroded.
Yeah, that whole connection with like the ancestors, the spirits in the underworld. This reminded me of let's talk with Marissa Tellez about Mayan beliefs about crocodiles being like I'm probably butchering this. I think it was something along the lines of being like farriers of the souls to the underworld or something like that. I could be butchering it though.
Right, which is really interesting because that's I mean there are again commonalities even that far away I know in northern Sulawesi, or I guess central Sulawesi in Lake Poso, they used to believe that saltwater crocodiles would ferry them from one side of the river to the other. So obviously it's not the underworld, but it's still that kind of a protector guardian type of mentality. And they believed that some crocodiles would be protectors they could call upon, that they were their ancestors, and they would ferry them across the river. They would help them, and they would protect them from other crocodiles that weren't ancestors that would prey upon them. And I think that's how they, I guess, managed to deal with the fact that occasionally people would be eaten by crocodiles in some areas quite frequently, and that's what they would use to explain that pretty much.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about the findings of your database so far, if you're free to talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's been we found a lot of stuff. That the one species that we're still kind of very data deficient on is the Nile crocodile, because so much of sub-Saharan Africa, things go unreported in a lot of areas. Well, in most areas, to be honest. And then, of course, some of the countries are in states of civil strife, lots of instability, and so crocodile attacks are kind of the least of their worry in many of these areas. So they don't really get reported. And many people probably don't even think that it's of interest to people in other countries. But I am slowly getting more data from Africa, especially from Zambia, Zimbabwe, and some of these areas in kind of the further south. I'm still having a really hard time in Ethiopia and Somalia, of course, because Somalia is it's in a state of conflict, has been for a very long time. In some of the other areas like Sudan, obviously, very hard to get data. But yeah, so the findings were basically, unfortunately, with saltwater crocodile, we found that, upwards of 150 or even more people are being killed a year by saltwater crocodiles. And that was, even if you look at the IUCN's website, they stated that it was only about 20 or 30 attacked per year. And that was what was believed up until about 2010. So unfortunately, that's not the case. There's a lot of reasons, likely to be a lot of reasons for it. Most of the attacks take place in Indonesia. That's what we know. I suspect in Papua New Guinea as well, but that's kind of what my PhD is going to find out. It's going to Papua New Guinea, because I do have one contact in the Gulf province of Papua New Guinea, and there are a lot of attacks, and I suspect it's the same in many of the other provinces. So,
is there any specific region in Indonesia that's like a heightened number of croc attacks compared to others?
well, in the previous decade, East Nusa Tenggara was kind of the major hotspot, which is why I visited it. And but there's a lot of hotspots. You have North Maluku, Sulawesi, Southeast Sulawesi especially is having a lot of attacks lately. And North Maluku is kind of the hotspot now. Riau province in Sumatra last year had a very, very high number of attacks. And then Borneo's always kind of been, it's always had a lot of attacks, but it's remained relatively stable. I haven't seen any massive spikes, but it's always very high. And then there's the odd areas that don't really have attacks, and I don't really know why, which is another reason I'd like to get into some of these areas, like Peninsular Malaysia. People often don't hear about crocodiles from there, but they are there. Saltwater crocodiles are there, and the surveys that have been conducted, which there aren't many in either Indonesia or Malaysia, there are very few, but the ones that have been done have shown low densities in both places. So I don't think crocodile density is the reason for it. Something else going on. And I'd like to figure out exactly what it is. I mean, crocodile density does have something to do with it, but not in these particular cases. I don't think it has as much to do with it as some other factor, probably human factor.
Okay. Are there any particular factors that you suspect more than others?
For sure. Obviously, environmental destruction has had even the local people will say that that's the reason in a lot of these areas. Habitat destruction, they'll say that crocodile attacks were rare before. Oil palm is a big one. And tin mining on Bangka and Belitung Islands. They have these tin mining pools, and they pretty much build them in crocodile habitat, and they destroy all the habitat, remove the mangroves, and a lot of the natural prey dies, and the crocodiles remain. So the tin mine workers are often attacked by crocodiles in Bangka Belitung, which is adding to one of the many dangers they face in the job, the multitude of dangers. In the case of Peninsular Malaysia, the reason there's few attacks, I suspect it may have to do with Peninsular Malaysia possibly, I don't know all the details, but possibly being more developed from a infrastructure standpoint, fewer people requiring the river, for daily needs, just not as impoverished, I think, as some other areas. But I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of impoverished areas in Peninsular Malaysia, but less so than perhaps in some of these other areas. That's just a theory that I'm getting at, but it requires more investigation. But like in Singapore crocodiles have come back. Saltwater crocodiles are now in Singapore again. I suspect they never really left, but they were probably so low in density before that you wouldn't see them. But now there's a breeding population, and conflict is nil because nobody, Singapore's a very wealthy country. Nobody's in the water. Nobody's going around the mangroves doing anything. It's a tourist attraction, but nobody's in there fishing. Nobody's bathing, or so that kind of stuff is going to result in less conflict.
Yeah. So, speaking of them, salties possibly having been extirpated from Singapore, in terms of saltwater crocodiles range, would you say their range is at their maximum extent historically, or have they been pushed out of areas?
Oh, they're extinct in a lot of their historical range. They're extinct in Vietnam. They're extinct in Cambodia. They're extinct in Thailand for the most part. There might be very small numbers near the border with Peninsular Malaysia, and maybe very small numbers near the border with Burma or Myanmar. I doubt there's anything breeding. I don't hear enough that would suggest that. And unfortunately, typically where there are, with the exception of Peninsular Malaysia and Palau, typically where there are saltwater crocodiles, you're going to have some conflict, especially if it's an area with humans using the waterways frequently. In Myanmar, they are only found in two areas. They're extinct everywhere else, including the infamous Ramree Island location. They've been extinct there for quite a while. I know Stephen Platt did research there in maybe almost 2 decades ago, a little less than 2 decades ago, and they found one nest that was non-viable, and they didn't find any signs of crocodiles. So there was maybe one still around that wasn't breeding, but yeah, they're largely extirpated. And then in India, they're only in two areas in the mainland, the Sundarbans and Bhitarkanika National Park. But yeah, so they're really not doing well in the northern part of the range. I mean, they're virtually eradicated from most areas. It's this kind of central and southern part where there's still plenty around. Well, not plenty, but they're around. And then, of course, here in Australia, the reason they're considered least concerned is entirely due to Australia, because we've got a lot, and it's great. It's awesome, and attacks are very rare here. Conflict is very rare, it's really great.
Yeah. I keep on, hearing and reading articles about how, particularly from, I think it's the Kimberley region or wherever, salties migrate to like Timor and other places like that. So is Northern Australia kind of acting as like a replenishing point for populations in other locations, perhaps?
I don't put a lot of weight in that theory, only because I mean, I imagine the odd one does likely make it to Timor and other areas, of course. Especially, I think the most movement occurs between Queensland and Papua New Guinea, because there's only a very, very small area of, it's basically, they're almost connected. The Torres Strait, and there's definitely movement. The genetics show that there is movement between Queensland and Papua New Guinea. Thus far, genetics, from what I understand, from Timor-Leste have shown that they're all of Timorese origin. They're not, there's none that they've found that were from Australian origin. And then, I mean, I would suspect the odd one does make it. I don't think it has any impact on attack frequency, which is something that has been suggested. I don't think so, because a lot of attacks are increasing in Timor inland, in landlocked habitat. There is the largest crocodile population in Timor, and likely throughout the entire Lesser Sunda Islands region, is in a place called Lake Irlalaro, which is a landlocked lake at not a high elevation, but higher than you expect to find salties. And the crocodiles there, they have no connection to the ocean. They are genetically distinct from the coastal population. Not enough to be a new species or even a new subspecies, but they are genetically distinct. And attacks there have also increased very significantly. So I just don't see any evidence that Australian crocodiles are the reason for an increase in the numbers of attacks. But they do move around a lot, and we're seeing a lot of movement. Like, they're moving into areas they haven't been seen in over half a century, well over half a century. Like, Bali is now occasionally seeing crocodiles. There was one very widely publicized case of about a 10-foot saltwater crocodile showing up on a big beach where there were thousands of people out there, and scared the hell out of everybody. And these are likely animals coming from East Nusa Tenggara, I would say, is the most likely source. But they're also showing up in Jakarta from time to time, which is really odd, because Jakarta is pretty much, there's no habitat at all, but they'll show up occasionally. And these are large animals coming in from the ocean, so it's very unlikely to be escapees from captivity. And so, yeah, it's a lot of interesting stuff going on. I'm really curious to see how things are going to pan out in the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah. So the other species you also keep track of, muggers. What were your findings for those guys?
What's that? Sorry, I had a little blip
what was
there
your
for
findings?
A second.
Yeah. What was your finding with muggers?
Well, with the muggers, so I worked with a lot of the Indian crocodile experts on this, because they had been collecting data as well, and we were finding that mugger attacks were actually quite frequent. The fatality rate's lower than saltwater and Nile, but it's still pretty high. And with the muggers, it's weird. In some areas, they are attacking and killing people at a rate similar to saltwater and Nile crocodiles. And then in other areas, they seem to be virtually harmless, where there's not harmless, but I mean, you're not seeing attacks at all. People are in the water, nothing's happening. And it's a very interesting situation. And again, I suspect some sort of human factor is involved with that. And some of these areas are quite close. I visited Gujarat, India, the year before last, in 2021, and in Vadodara city, which is also known as Baroda, attacks are very frequent. There's a river that runs through the city called the Vishwamitri River, and back in 2014, I think they killed something like, I don't know, several people just within 2 weeks. And it continues to occur there. Conflict has dropped considerably, I think, but it's still attacks are quite frequent. And only not that far away, within a couple hours driving distance, a place called Anand, there's an area where they do a croc count every year. I'm sure you've heard of, and there's no conflict. Attacks are virtually non-existent, and people use the waterways with the crocodiles. So, I don't really know what the difference is. Perhaps natural prey abundance could be something, because I know, in these rivers that run through major urban areas, there's going to be less natural prey. Possibly human population densities, pollution. I mean, it could be any number of things. Definitely more studies need to be done on it, because it could lead to better understanding of why muggers are attacking people so frequently. In places like the Chombo River, attacks are very frequent, but with muggers. It's very seasonal though. From the months of basically December until March, I don't record. I record very few mugger attacks, maybe just a handful. And then once we hit March, things increase, and they gradually increase. And then over the summer months into fall, it's just constant. So definitely, it's like the American alligator, where there's a strong seasonal component to attacks. Whereas with saltwater crocodile, even if there is, like, but even the attacks occur in the dry season as well here in Australia. And then of course they go across both hemispheres, so you can have attacks year round, and same in Africa. So
Yeah. So the location of that crocodile survey, does that have like a high human density around there, or is it a relatively low density area?
I don't know in that specific area. I mean, it's India. There are going. I mean, I think it's in general it's higher density, but I think it's definitely less than Baroda for sure. How much less would be the question, and of course lifestyles. They say that they respect the crocodiles, and that's why nothing happens. That they don't bug them, and then they don't get bugged by them. And so there's a lot of interesting beliefs there, and they don't tend to have any problems with the crocodiles. They like them in those villages. So it's there's cultural differences. It's very interesting. I know they're doing a lot of studies on it right now, so should be interesting to see what they find.
It reminds me a little bit of those West African communities with the Sukas, the West African crocs, how they're kind of famous for their relationship with those.
Right, like in I think Gambia, Burkina Faso, they have those ponds that they live with them when there's no conflict. I mean, Sucus is still kind of strange, because there's areas where there are frequent attacks, but I don't know if it's Sucus involved or if it's Niloticus, because there are these kind of transitionary zones, or I guess areas where they don't really know which species is there. Specifically, Central African Republic, there's a lot of attacks there in a couple of the lakes there, and I don't really know. I've talked to Matt Shirley about this, because he's the one he's the West African croc guy, and yeah, they're not really sure which species is there, as far as I know, possibly both in different areas. So but yeah, Sucus is very interesting. I'd like to get into West Africa to see some of those, but at some point.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's really interesting that even the ancient Egyptians were somehow able to tell Sucus and Niloticus apart, because all the mummies are of Sucus, even though Niloticus' natural range is around there.
Right, yeah. Which makes me wonder if Sucus got up into that area as well, or if it's yeah, I don't know. It's odd, because Niloticus, I guess, got all the way up into Israel at some point, into the Kibara swamps, and they were apparently eradicated from that area and from around Cairo sometime in the 19th century, from what I understand. But of course, today Niloticus only goes as far north as Lake Nasser in Egypt, and then nothing north of that, is from what I understand. But yeah, it's interesting, and there are really weird ones. Like Sucus's range kind of goes to the east, really far east, like just kind of juts over into Ethiopia. There's a river in Ethiopia that is nothing but Sucus, but the rest of Ethiopia, from my best of my knowledge, is all Niloticus. So it's just really, really bizarre distribution. So it's probably fragmented a lot from historic times. And of course, they used to be present throughout the Saharan desert. And then as, aridification occurred, they became fragmented. And then, slowly went extinct in areas, probably also due to human activities, humans killing them in some of these areas because very small populations. And it looks like that's probably going to continue to occur with the Saharan populations, I think. Matt was saying recently that the population in Chad, in one of the, I think they're called Vueltas. My pronunciation may be way off on that, but it's kind of a almost like a an oasis in the desert, and a little area with water, and they had sucus there, and I know that people for a long time have been photographing them stuff, but from what I understand there's very few left there. So yeah, it just seems like they're kind of slowly disappearing from these areas, but maybe what we're seeing in Ethiopia with that little eastern that river going through there, maybe they it's part of something historical. So yeah.
Yeah. But circling back to the muggers, that one research, that survey site, is that in this like same drainage basin as the river that goes to that city? I'm sorry, I'm not good with those names.
Oh no, it's fine. I don't think so. I mean, it's that in the survey site, it's lakes. It's a lot of the lakes and villages and ponds and stuff like that. I don't think they have any connection to the river at any time. But muggers, being muggers, they're very mobile on land, so they often walk long distances. I mean, even salties will do that, but not to the degree that muggers will. Muggers are very, very terrestrial animals, and so I suspect that's part of the reason they get around so much. And then, of course, I think historically people may have put them in certain areas as well. But yeah, so there's a few main rivers there that are kind of like, you have the Narmada River, you have the Mahi River. The Narmada River still has a lot of crocodiles. The Mahi, not very many, I don't think. If some very few at all, I think. But then you have the Vishwamitri, which I believe is connected to. I don't remember which river it's connected to, but yeah, the ponds in where they do the surveys, those aren't. I don't think they're connected to any river at any time, really.
Okay, well, you did right. So that muggers are very terrestrial and mobile, but I was going to suggest how some crocodilians have really strong river basin genetics. If that might have play a role in that or not. But
yeah, I mean, it'd be. I mean, I don't think they've done any genetic studies. It would be interesting to see what genetics they can find in the Vishwamitri crocs versus the ones up in Anand. And and then possibly I don't know if size would have anything to do with it, because obviously with saltwater crocodiles we see the most dangerous animals tend to be in the 4 meter range. Whereas you get larger than that, those aren't, you don't see as much conflict from larger animals, mostly because they're not as common, but also those 4 meter animals are the ones that are typically coming into areas after being forced out of other areas by larger crocodiles. With muggers, I don't know, you don't have the territoriality that you see with saltwater crocodiles, so I don't know how much that would play a role, but it'd be interesting to see the different dynamics between species. Lately, I've been looking at the saltwater crocodile, so I'm going to have a lot more insight on their on how they behave for that reason specifically. And the behavior is so much different between them and a lot of the other species, mainly due to how territorial they are.
You want to talk about some of the differences in their behavior compared to other crocodilians?
Yeah, I mean, I was asked by some people that are replanting mangroves. They're kind of doing reforestation in Indonesia, and they sent me an email asking about how they could prevent their people working on it from being attacked by crocodiles while replanting the mangroves. And so the woman I was talking to had worked in Africa, and she with Nile crocodiles, and they had their own protocol for that. And I said, there are important differences you have to take into account. And with saltwater crocodiles being so territorial, and given their habitat, the mangrove habitat, sometimes it can be very, very difficult to know if crocodiles are even in the area, especially if you have just one large male hanging around. You're not going to see them unless you get lucky. And so I told her, do not rely on surveys of the area alone to know if there are crocodiles present in the area. Because if you have one large animal, well, some of these areas, I suspect, where they're finding really low densities, it's just one big male around that has been attacking people, and not a lot of crocodiles. And you have the mangrove habitat can also be very difficult to see crocodiles in. They can hide. You have these big muddy rivers, and then you have low densities. Their behavior, they're very territorial, so you're not going to see a lot of other male crocodiles around. And that would be, I mean, the main behavioral difference is territoriality, I would say, when it comes to difference between, some of these larger species. The saltwater crocodile also not quite as terrestrial as say the mugger crocodile. And yeah, when it comes to like the attack, like I've talked to a lot of people about attacks between Nile crocodiles and saltwater crocodiles, and a lot of it comes down to, again, densities. The saltwater crocodile is naturally going to be a much lower density species than the Nile crocodile because of that territorial behavior. So, like you'll see videos in Africa of this just wall to wall Nile crocodiles basking along the banks, and you would
Yeah.
never you would only see that here in Australia in one area that I can think of called Shady Camp, which is about an hour and a half from where I'm sitting right now. And there they have an abnormally high density of saltwater crocodiles, and it all has to do with abnormally high prey densities. So there's not as much conflict, not as much territoriality. But in general, you would never see that with saltwater crocodiles. You'll see, you know, you won't, yeah, you'll just see like one, and then you go a distance and see another. You're not going to see a whole bunch basking next to each other.
Yeah. Uh, any suspected reason why they're so much more territorial than other species?
Oh, I don't. I'm sure that has something to do with genetics and just long. Yeah, I'm not really sure on that. I would say likely genetics of some kind. Long-term evolution, just different speciation, different reasons for it. So.
Yeah. Um, so is there any like overarching patterns you've noticed in attacks with salties versus like other species?
Um, yeah, I mean there are, and again, it's hard to draw conclusions because the Nile data is so sparse. But I've noticed that saltwater crocodile victims tend to be adult male fishermen. I mean, you do get women, you do get children, but the vast majority are adult male fishermen. And with Nile crocodiles, I see a much higher percentage of women and children bathing, washing clothes. And I think that mostly has to do with the habitat. You're getting a lot of saltwater crocodiles in estuarine areas. They do, they can be found up to over 1,000 kilometers inland in freshwater habitat. But a lot of the attacks are occurring in areas where, along the coastline, you've got mostly fishermen who are in the water. And then, of course, the fish are attracting the crocodiles. They're struggling the nets, stuff like that. Whereas in Africa, the Nile crocodiles, you're not going to see them as in high densities along the coastline and in these areas. They're inland in freshwater rivers and in dams and lakes. And in these areas, are areas people are using for bathing and also for fishing, but for bathing, washing clothes. So I see a much higher percentage of women being killed while washing clothes and cleaning utensils and stuff like that. And that does happen in the saltwater crocodile range, just not as frequently. You probably see it more in New Guinea, I would think, because the rivers are so large and you're getting crocodiles further inland. And then in some parts of Sumatra. But yeah, by and far, it's going to be male fishermen. That's kind of our main demographic that is being attacked by saltwater crocodiles, which makes things very difficult because crocodile exclusion enclosures, which I'm sure you've heard of, are quite effective at preventing, or at least not preventing, but mitigating crocodile attacks in freshwater areas where the victims are mainly washing clothes or bathing. But with fishermen, it doesn't help at all. So it's a very
Yeah.
unique conflict situation.
Yeah. Uh, and I'm guessing muggers are more similar to Niles in terms of their attacks than they are to salties.
Yeah, yeah. In general, it seems to be the case. There's a lot of people bathing. The one thing I have noticed with muggers, and this may just be because it's not mentioned with other attacks with other species, but like a very high percentage of the attacks often occur when people are with their livestock. So I suspect livestock being present plays a role, the same way that in Florida there's a lot of attacks when people have their dogs with them, and they often become the secondary target after the dog being the initial target. And I suspect in India, I mean, this week a man was attacked. His wife saved him. It's been circulating all over the internet, and he was, I believe, bathing his goats or his cattle at the time. A lot of the attacks, they're either bathing their cattle or at least they had their cattle near them and they went down to the water to drink or whatever. So I suspect that the livestock are attracting the crocodiles, and then this person comes around and they become the kind of default, the victim they go to instead. Yeah, so.
Yeah, 2,000-pound cow versus 200-pound hairless monkey. Which one are you choosing?
Yeah, exactly. It makes it's a potentially easier prey item, even though we do look odd, with our height. The um, in some of these areas, crocodiles probably been preying upon people for quite a long time. Not all of them, in areas where they haven't, of course, if they learn that a human's easy prey, that can be problematic. But in some areas, they kind of always have. So that's another thing I'd be curious to see, because in Papua New Guinea, um, I'd imagine man eaters probably go unchecked for quite a long time. And so there may be crocs that's just what they do, and they have for a very long time. Which brings me to another interesting thing. There's a lot of talks of culling in Queensland, Australia, because they believe there's a ton of crocodile attacks, which there aren't. But and one potential unintended consequence of that is if they remove crocodiles from Queensland's waterways, they're just going to move in from Papua New Guinea, and you may be getting crocodiles that are already experienced man eaters moving in. So yeah, there's a lot of things they're not taking into account. But yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. But yeah.
Evicting the squatter and then selling the house to a psychopath. So.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So, talk about your research with American crocs, the acutus. You're talking about the head length to body length ratios. Want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So yeah, now that I don't know if it's ever going to go through, I can talk freely about it. I for many years, ever since 2011, I've been going to a place called La Manzanilla in Jalisco, which is just an amazing little coastal village. Wonderful people, became great friends with many of the residents, and they have an estuary there that is full of American crocodiles. Probably very unnaturally high densities, because I think they've moved some problem crocodiles there, and people feed them there. So they almost behave like captive animals, even though they're not. They are wild. They can move around wherever they want, but they often hang out in one area. And many of these animals are abnormally large. There are at least a dozen over 4 meters, and a couple over 4.5 meters, possibly up to five, in excess of five, possibly even, which would be obviously records for acutus, confirmed records at least. That there's not really. I don't think anybody's been keeping track of record links in acutus. So when you can't really find when you look for saltwater, you find low long and the Fly River salty. You can't really find the actual measurements for acutus. You just have a lot of anecdotal stuff. But yeah, I suspect if there's going to be a record acutus, it's going to be either there or at the Tarcoles River in Costa Rica, which also has very large animals. But at this estuary in La Manzanilla, they're easy to access. They're easy to catch. They're all very large. We did find one that was even larger than the ones that were hanging out at the front. We found it kind of hiding in the back, and it seemed to not be as interested in human contact. And that's the one we really wanted to catch, but he was very, very shy. We did see him at night once, got close to him, but then he darted into the water. He was massive though, and unlike the other ones are fed by people, so they're really, really robust. He was thin and long, which I suspect he was longer than the other ones, but just not as overfed as they are, which is something we see here in Australia as well. A lot of the crocs in the Adelaide River it's hard to tell how big they are, because the bulk can be misleading, which is also true of the Nile crocodile. Many people see Nile crocodiles and think they're larger than salties. It's not the case. They're heavier, but they're not as long. So, and again, that bulk can really be misleading. But yeah, La Manzanilla, we were doing this. We wanted to look. Basically, my goal was to try to get enough head length to body length ratios to be able to kind of build a good kind of base ratio for large American crocodiles over 4 meters, and then use that to estimate the length of the skull, the record American crocodile skull that is in the New York. I believe it's in the Smithsonian. Is it in Smithsonian or Natural History? One of the two.
I think it's Natural History. I think
yeah,
Smithsonian. I think it's in DC.
Right, yeah, because I've been to Smithsonian, yeah, because I've spent a lot of time in DC, never spent any time in New York. So, yeah, so the Natural History Museum there, they have, I believe it's a 70 centimeter acutus skull, I believe, and it would be interesting to see the ratios, because with saltwater crocodiles, once they get to a certain size, the head to body length ratio, you can have 8.8 to 1, I think is what low long was, which is just, that's the ratio is drastically different than the usual 7 to 1 ratio. Now, what I was seeing with the American crocodile was that the heads were much, much larger in proportion to the body than saltwater crocodiles. So I suspect that 70 centimeter skull is not from a 20-foot crocodile. I suspect it's not, just given that. But I don't know. Again, we couldn't measure anything. The largest we measured was 4.4 meters. So we couldn't measure anything, in the 4.7, 4.8, because one of the bigger ones we wanted to catch, the minute he saw the rope, he darted. He knew. So I suspect they've tried to catch him before, or maybe they have caught him. But yeah, so really big animals. But I try to keep things. I try to not to buy into the myth and try to really get the actual. I would love nothing more than to find a 6-meter American crocodile, but I got to find it. So yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of Acutus, I don't know if you keep any track records of their attacks or anything like that, but I keep hearing like varying things. Like it kind of depends, like locale or what the local population or whatever in terms of their attack rates. Is there any truth to that?
So yeah, I keep track of every species. So every crocodilian species
Okay.
there is, I keep it on. And yeah, I've got a lot of Acutus attack data. And for a few years in the last decade, things were getting pretty intense. I mean, not by old world standards. We're talking, maximum 6 people killed per year, compared to, even the mugger kills around 40 or 50 people a year. So it's not anywhere close. But the American crocodile was fourth. It's just a very distant fourth out of the most dangerous, most attacking crocodile species, and more so than the American alligator, at least the last decade. And it does appear to be location specific. I suspect lifestyle factors have a major role, as well as a big one with Acutus, I think, is feeding by humans. I'm sure Marissa told you all about the issues with that in Belize. I spent a lot of time with her in Belize, and illegal feeding is a major issue there. It makes them much more aggressive. I remember there was a crocodile they were talking about on Ambergris Key that would sometimes, they had fed it so much it would charge out of the water, and as golf carts were passing. So that's a major issue. Obviously in Florida, you've only had one attack with 2 victims, and both non-fatal. And then there's no reliable records of people being killed in Florida ever. There's a very, very suspicious record from 1925, I think. But yeah, I don't put much credence in it, because it just seems the guy claims he shot it and then it was killed by it after he shot it on land. I don't know. It's a little too suspicious to include. But in Mexico and Costa Rica, people are killed. This year, no one's been killed yet, at least in terms of what's been reported. But some years have been pretty bad. 2015, I believe, 2016 were the worst years in Mexico. But things have quieted down a lot with American crocodiles. I'm not sure why, but they have quieted down a fair bit.
So what about the American alligator? Where's that rank in, I guess, danger level?
Well, American alligator is really tough because things vary so much. For 7 years, there was not a single fatal attack. From 2007 to 2015, there was nothing. And then now lately, it's just been like last year was horrible. 4 people were killed last year, which is unprecedented. That's never happened before. And I think it has to do with a lot of human behavior stuff, especially the dog situation. And also last year in the fatal attack, I believe 3 of the 4 victims were over the age of 75. And 2 of them were over the age of, I think, 85. So we're talking about very elderly individuals being attacked by alligators in Florida, which is, it's a whole other ballgame trying to figure out how to mitigate that, because I suspect in many of those cases a younger person would have lived. Especially, I'm sure you've seen the video of the woman who had her dog, and the alligator charged out of the water and dragged her into the water and killed her. And that was only, I mean, it looks like about a 3-meter American alligator. I don't think, even for saltwater crocodiles, a 3-meter animal, most people are going to survive the attack. So, her age likely was a factor. So I don't know, maybe in the elderly community in places like Florida, maybe educating people more, maybe something, trying to get them to understand the danger that may be posed by this, especially when dogs. I mean, I don't think that alligator would have had any interest in her had she not been walking her dog near the lagoon. And I think that's the case in a lot of attacks in Florida and in South Carolina. South Carolina's had some pretty significant increase in attacks as well, especially around Hilton Head Island, which is a really expensive area, but there's a lot of alligators there. So yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, for a while they were pretty far down on the numbers of attacks. The black caiman was higher. They were below the black caiman and the American crocodile, and even the Morelet's crocodile for a few years. The Morelet's crocodile was attacking and killing quite a few people, especially in there's a part of Mexico where they had killed people pretty frequently. But yeah, lately the last year things have gotten really bad, but we'll see if that lasts. I suspect that has something also to do with weather. I remember the last time there was a really bad spate of American alligator attacks was 2006, where 3 people were killed. And there was also, I don't know if it was another La Nina or if it was something else going on or it's a drought, but they seem to coincide with these bizarre weather events. So I think that has something to do with American alligator aggression.
Yeah. Might also be the fact that Florida's population has also spiked with a bunch of non-alligator familiar people just moving in, not knowing how to behave around them.
Right, I'm sure you're getting a lot of especially older people moving to Florida after retirement, aren't aware of the danger, or maybe think the danger is minimal, which it really is minimal. But I always tell people, dogs are crocodilian magnets, regardless of the species. They're going to attract crocodilians because they're very loud. They have no, in the water, they have no defense at all. So they're just easy targets for crocodilians. And I think that they're just gonna, if you want to bring crocodiles in, bring a dog around, and that'll bring crocodiles in. And so and alligators. So I think that's something that maybe should be targeted more in Florida, is telling people, look, if you want to avoid attacks, I don't think alligators are going to charge out of the water at people unless you have a dog with you. Otherwise, the dangers, if you're swimming, that's a whole other story. But walking along shore, I just don't, yeah, I think you curb a lot of this with that.
Yeah. Let's see here. So what are top 10 most dangerous crocodilians? I mean, obviously Salties, Niles, and I guess Muggers take the top 3, but what's after that?
Fourth would be the American crocodile. But it's a distant fourth, very distant fourth. But that would be fourth. These are based on the raw number of attacks for the last decade. Basically, I'm only basing it on the last decade because that's really the only where there's reliable data. So it would be that, followed by the black caiman, American alligator, Morelet's crocodile. The Morelet's crocodile is the city called Tampico in Mexico, in Tamaulipas. I visited there in 2021 as well. And they kill people much more frequently than you'd expect for that species. It's specifically in that city, which is really, really bizarre. And they're pretty sizable animals. It's interesting. And then you have beyond that, not really. There's nothing. Most of the other species aren't really responsible for human deaths with any frequency at all, really. I mean, Sucus maybe, but again, that's it's questionable, and it's not frequent. It definitely would not be frequent, but maybe 1 or 2 per year, maybe. And then you're getting into, beyond that, species that are either too rare or just like the Orinoco crocodile is very large, and there are historical records of large crocodiles, presumably Orinoco crocodiles, but I don't know what the distribution would have been, along the Orinoco River, even attacking boats and pulling people out of boats. So these are historical records, so it's hard to say. Cuban crocodile, known to be very aggressive, but I only know of one fatal attack that occurred in 1996. And the late great Toby Ramos provided me with the data while I was in Mexico. There was a spear fisherman who was spearfishing in the Zapata swamp who was killed by Cuban crocodile. And beyond that, I mean, there's some anecdotal records of Siamese crocodiles killing children, but very few for adults. There were a spate of fatal attacks along the middle Mekong River near the border with Laos in Cambodia in the 1920s and 1910s, and could have been big Siamensis, could have also been inland sea porosis. Sorry, I'm alternating between common names and scientific names. So either large Siamese crocodiles or saltwater crocodiles. I think a lot of people, yeah. So people often underestimate where salties can be found. especially historically. They could have been all over the place because they're, here in Australia, they with recovery, they keep moving further up into rivers, and the only reason they're not living permanently in areas like Catherine Gorge and these upstream areas is because they're removed when they find them there. But if they weren't removed, these big males would likely stay there. There's no breeding habitat, but you'll still have individual animals living there. So yeah, like we have records from Burma or from Myanmar, from way far up the Irrawaddy River, um, maybe 800 kilometers upriver, where they believed that it was mugger crocodiles attacking people, but there's no evidence that muggers were actually ever in Myanmar. And I suspect it was inland saltwater crocodiles. And I've talked with Stephen Platt, and he agrees it's probably inland saltwater crocodiles. So it's hard to say with these older ones. But also then you've got the smaller caiman species will bite people, and it happens somewhat frequently because there's a lot of them around and people step on their tails and stuff. But I only have one authenticated fatal attack involving a spectacled caiman, and that attack was on an infant. So when it comes to children, the rules change entirely because American alligators of 5 feet in length have been responsible for fatal attacks on children. So that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if Paleosuchus somehow managed to kill someone, I mean, I wouldn't be mad. That'd be impressive.
I've spent a lot of time with Paleosuchus trigonatus in the Amazon, and they're a beautiful species. But they do have attitude. I suspect to make up for their size. But they're a lot of fun because they're not as aquatic as a lot of the other species. You'll find them walking around the forest floor sometimes, and it's pretty cool to just be wandering around in the Amazon and finding a Paleosuchus just walking around. And yeah, I only know of one bite involving them, and it was one that had somehow wandered into a restaurant bathroom from a water body, and they just swung around and bit the guy in the leg. So not really an attack, but yeah. So.
So for people who are not croc wise and don't know how to act safe around crocodilians, you want to give some basic guidelines on how to behave safely in areas where crocodilians live.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's going to vary depending on the species in terms of how cautious you have to be. In a place like Florida, Louisiana, just don't bring dogs around close to water bodies where alligators are present, which in Florida is going to be probably most water bodies. And I'm sure there are plenty of places you can walk dogs that aren't going to be along lagoons. I mean, I know how nice it is to walk a dog along a river or a lagoon, but it's just not worth it. And then small children, always keep a close eye on small children if you're going to be in an area with alligators, like that unfortunate incident in Disney World. That I feel like, if the parents were, I don't know what proximity the parents were to the child, but from what I understand, the alligator is not very large. So if you're very close to your child, you're holding their hand or whatever, I think they'll be safe. And also, probably just don't walk along the lagoon shore if you're with a small child. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't know this, so it's not their fault. They just don't, they're not aware. They come from somewhere else where they're not aware of that. And then with something like the saltwater crocodile, you need to maintain a good distance from waterways at all times, especially areas where there's really high densities. Like here in Australia, we recommend camping at least 100 meters from the water's edge if you're going to be camping. If you're walking, 5 to 6 meters from the water's edge, because they can charge out, but they can't move for long distances on land at a high speed. So it's going to be a big burst of energy and then nothing. So as long as you're outside of that striking distance, you'll be fine. With them, obviously, definitely don't swim in crocodilian habitat, but that goes without saying. With saltwater crocodiles, Yusuke Fukuda wrote a great paper with his colleagues on the what factors led to the higher fatality rates, and they found that when people were swimming in deep water, greater than I believe half a meter, the fatality rate just skyrockets. Especially when you have 4-meter animals and above from 4.5 and above, it's virtually you're not going to live. And that's because there's just nothing you can do in that depth of water when a crocodile attacks. Whereas if you're on shore, the chance of death decreases significantly for most victims. Of course, that's not taking into account elderly individuals or small children. But yeah, so don't swim. If you're fishing, never gut fish or clean them near the water's edge, because that's going to attract crocodiles. If you're in an area with saltwater crocodiles or Nile crocodiles, always use a net to bring your fish into the boat. Don't put your hand in the water to grab the fish, because often saltwater crocodiles will, follow the fish in as you're pulling it in. And I've seen it many times here in videos where crocodiles just swim up and steal the fish right off the line. And if the guy's hand was in the water, he would have been taken with it, because it's often very large animals. If you're in an area where there's a lot of big salties, don't go in a boat that's smaller than 4 meters, because we've had some incidents here. One incident specifically where a man was pulled out of his boat by a big salty and eaten. And that was, I don't recall the size of the boat, but in general, they say anything under 4 meters is not safe. I've been in a 3.5 meter boat in some of these areas, and it's dicey. There's certain areas where I just wouldn't do it, period. And if you do it, don't stop for long periods. Keep moving. Because if you're moving, a croc's not going to do anything. But if you're sitting in a place for a long time, it gives them time to get curious and movement. So yeah, there's a lot of different things you could do. Don't feed crocodiles. That's a big thing. Any crocodilian, do not feed them, because that's going to make them associate people with food, seek people out, follow people around, and hang around in human habitat. So
great. So other than the Croc Attack database, are there any other things to do? I know you mentioned you did wildlife photography at the very beginning.
Right. I still do that. I plan on writing a book on human crocodile conflict, given all the information I have. So I plan on using a lot of my photos for that. And I kind of have my own personal goal, kind of a bucket list item, is to photograph every crocodilian species in the wild, and get good photos, not just a throwaway photo of every crocodilian species in the wild. It's going to be very difficult to accomplish, especially now that they've split all these West African species up. But I was halfway
just keep
there.
Make up,
yeah, exactly.
They just keep up making up new ones out of the blue.
Yeah, they're getting more. Matt Shirley was up here a couple weeks ago, and he did a presentation on his work in West Africa, and it's very interesting seeing the differences between the African slender snouted species and the dwarf crocodiles, because there are very pronounced differences, and I didn't know enough about the species to really even notice that kind of stuff. They're very it seems very, very poorly studied species up until now. So it's just, there's all this new information coming out. But obviously it's going to make my goal a lot more difficult. And then there's some species that are just hard to photograph, period, like the Temistoma, which is one of my favorite species. Is very difficult to see in the wild because it's very cryptic, it's very aquatic, it doesn't come out to bass much. So that's one that I really want to get, but it's going to cost me a fortune to do it. And there's no guarantee I'm going to be able to find it. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're going to New Guinea soon, so you should probably be able to check off at least 2 more species, both the New Guinea species.
Right. Yeah. Walleye and Nova Guinea. Yeah. I hope to be able to check them both off. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I think we about covered it in terms of croc bite and what I've been working on. Unless there's anything else you're interested about.
Well, I don't know you too well, so I don't know what else to ask you about.
Oh, okay. I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, yeah, just hoping to work doing a lot of work in PNG, Papua New Guinea in the future. Trying to do whole country wide surveys, which is going to be very difficult, but I think we get creative with it. We should be able to accomplish it. It's going to be similar to kind of what Jan Vanderploeg and Matt Bryan did in the Solomon Islands, where they did kind of a countrywide human crocodile conflict survey. So we're going to try to do that and hit, not everywhere, but we'll hit as many areas as we can where we think attacks are going to be highest. And I'm really curious to see if there have been any walleye or Nova Guinea attacks, because they can both grow to over 4 meters. And it's very hard to know because saltwater crocodiles get far inland there as well. So you can't really know unless you talk to locals, I suppose. And even then it's not entirely certain. So it'll be a lot of interesting stuff that I think we'll find. Some of the villages I'll be visiting have been locations where they found some of the largest crocodiles in the world, like that Fly River crocodile at, I believe it was Obo village along the Fly River. I'll be visiting that village. And they caught another large crocodile recently. I don't recall if it was measured or not. So it'll be very interesting. I think in addition to the official stuff for the conflict, attack related stuff, I think we'll also find other things that will be interesting that I can possibly follow up on after the PhD, or even talk to other people about potentially doing. So.
All right. Well, where can people find you out online?
Well, pretty soon this Croc Attack website will launch. I don't know what the address is going to be just yet. And then people will be able to access the database that way. It'll be a little different than the previous website. We're hoping to have more maps and stuff like that, and I'll have species profiles. They go into. I'll have updated distribution maps because most of the saltwater crocodile distribution maps are at least 150 years out of date. So I'm going to be, yeah, they're pretty bad. But the saltwater crocodile is by far the worst offender when it comes to the maps being really bad. And then, of course, the Nile crocodile maps need to be split between Sucus and Niloticus. But so I'm going to do a lot of updated distribution maps, and then kind of a danger level post by the species, so people can kind of look at what species are dangerous, what aren't, what not to do, kind of the stuff that I talked about here. And there will also be an area where you can download papers that have used the Croc Attack data, depending on whether the publications will allow us to host those papers. But the ones that we can host, we'll put on there. And yeah, so right now I'm currently running the whole project, and then I have input from Simon Pooley, who is a crocodile specialist in England, and a few other people. And I'm hoping to bring in a lot more regional experts to kind of, be able to just branch it out and make it a much larger thing. But and then I'm also going to be possibly doing some television in the future, but I don't know. That's still up in the air. I'm sure television it can go away at the last minute. So we'll see what happens with that. But
yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
All right. Thanks. Bye.